The American frontier has always been painted in broad strokes of courage, resilience, and adventure. The popular imagination is filled with images of wagon trains cutting across endless prairies, families huddled in log cabins with rifles by the door, and stoic pioneers forging new lives in an unforgiving wilderness. But beneath the myth lies a darker truth, one so unsettling that it was long buried in silence or warped into grotesque cautionary tales. For the frontier was not just a land of freedom, it was a graveyard of desperation. And in the harshest moments of survival, hunger stripped people down to their most primal instincts. In the frozen isolation of mountain passes, in cabins buried under snowdrifts, and in the quiet desolation of trail camps, men and women confronted a choice most of us cannot fathom: to die of starvation or to feed on the flesh of the dead. The most infamous of these stories, the Donner Party, has been told so many times that it has become almost a macabre legend. Yet the Donners were not alone. Across the 19th century frontier, from the Rocky Mountains to the plains of Texas, from Arctic expeditions to mining camps, the whispers of cannibalism followed the settlers wherever food and hope ran out. These stories were recorded reluctantly, often buried in diaries, court records, and faded newspapers. Some were dismissed as rumor, others sensationalized as scandal. But together, they reveal something crucial about the true American frontier. It was not just a test of grit against the elements. It was a crucible where civilization itself sometimes broke down, and people reverted to instincts that society could not accept. To understand why these cannibalism stories are not just gruesome side notes, but essential to the history of the frontier, we must step into the shoes of those who made the journey west. Imagine walking thousands of miles across untamed land with nothing but a wagon, some cattle, and your family beside you. The weather could turn without warning. A single wrong turn could add weeks to your route. And when food ran low, you could not simply stop at a store or radio for help. Hunger was not a passing discomfort. It was a death sentence, ticking closer with every day you could not find game or forage. One of the earliest and least remembered accounts came not from the 1840s rush west, but from the era of early trapping and exploration. In the 1820s, fur traders working for the American Fur Company pushed deep into the Rocky Mountains, where winters could entomb entire valleys. In diaries recovered years later, there are hints carefully worded that when game ran out, some men turned on the bodies of those who had already perished. They would speak of using what was necessary, or taking sustenance from fallen companions. The words avoided the blunt horror, but their meaning was unmistakable. Frontier cannibalism was not always about killing. More often, it was about scavenging, the desperate act of eating the dead to give the living another day. But there were darker episodes. Episodes where hunger blurred moral boundaries so completely that the line between eating the dead and creating the dead grew thin. In 1833, a lesser-known wagon train traveling through the Rocky Mountains vanished during an early snowstorm. Months later, when survivors stumbled out of the mountains half-crazed and skeletal, they confessed to authorities that their group had descended into chaos. The strong preyed on the weak. Bodies were stripped in the night, and arguments over who would be sacrificed next ended in violence. The newspapers at the time called it a tragedy too shocking for print, and so the details were buried. It's easy to judge these people from the comfort of the present, but hunger of the kind they faced rewires the human mind. Medical accounts of starvation show that after days without food, the body begins to consume itself. Muscles waste, thoughts slow, and hallucinations creep in. By the third week, the body is in such agony that the brain begins to lose moral reasoning. For pioneers trapped in snowbound cabins or in wagon circles surrounded by blizzards, the sight of a dead companion could trigger a horrifying calculation. Do nothing, and everyone dies. Eat, and maybe some will live to see spring. The Donner Party, which became stranded in the Sierra Nevada, during the brutal winter of 1846 to 1847 is often treated as a singular, sensational story. But they were simply the most publicized example of a phenomenon that had been happening quietly for decades. When their food ran out and oxen lay frozen under the snow, the survivors did what others had already done in hidden corners of the frontier. They consumed the bodies of the dead. What made their story explode across the nation was not just the cannibalism, but the fact that the survivors were respectable families, not anonymous trappers or outcasts. They had diaries. They had letters. And when they staggered out of the mountains and told their story, America recoiled. But the Donners were only one chapter. In 1856, another wagon train, the Willie and Martin handcart companies of Mormon pioneers, faced starvation in Wyoming. Snowstorms buried their path and supplies ran dry. Contemporary reports suggest that while official Mormon histories downplayed the worst, whispers among survivors spoke of bodies being used in the night. Whether scavenging occurred has never been definitively proven, but the fact that it was suspected reveals how common the association between frontier starvation and cannibalism had become. Even more shocking were the stories from frontier prisons and isolated military outposts. Soldiers stationed in remote forts sometimes faced winters without supply trains. In one infamous episode in the Dakotas, a small group of soldiers trapped by snow admitted years later that they survived only by consuming 2 of their dead comrades. Official records called it subsisting on unconventional means. The euphemism hid a truth that military authorities preferred to forget. And yet, the American frontier was not unique in this horror. Similar stories come from Arctic expeditions of the same era, where British and American sailors stranded in ice were later found to have eaten their crewmates. What made the frontier distinct was the frequency of these incidents. Thousands of settlers moved westward each year, and each journey carried the risk of being caught in an environment that could kill you in weeks if you miscalculated. The farther from civilization you went, the closer cannibalism lurked as a shadow possibility. For native peoples who had lived in these lands for centuries, survival strategies were better adapted. They knew how to find food in frozen landscapes, how to store roots, how to dry and preserve meat. But for European settlers, unused to such extremes, survival often came down to desperation. Ironically, some of the earliest reports of cannibalism on the frontier came not from native peoples themselves, but from settlers who accused them of it as a way to deflect attention. In reality, it was often the newcomers who resorted to eating the dead. The silence around these stories was deliberate. In a nation building its mythology of courage and divine destiny, cannibalism was an intolerable stain. Newspapers reported on it when unavoidable, but survivors were often shunned, accused of barbarism, or erased from the record. For many families, the story ended not with survival, but with shame that lasted generations. To admit to eating human flesh was to admit that the frontier dream had turned into a nightmare. But if you peel back the layers of silence, a pattern emerges. Cannibalism was not a freak occurrence on the frontier. It was a recurring reality, a hidden tax of survival paid in flesh. These stories force us to ask uncomfortable questions about the limits of human endurance and about how thin the line really is between civilization and savagery. And here is something chilling to remember. The frontier cannibalism stories we know are only the ones that left records. For every Donner Party, there were likely dozens of smaller, undocumented tragedies where no survivors lived to tell, or where survivors kept their secret buried to the grave. The frontier was vast, and its silence could swallow whole communities. As unsettling as this subject is, it reveals a truth we cannot ignore. The American frontier was not only a land of opportunity, it was a crucible of hunger, where survival sometimes demanded the unthinkable. And if you think you could have done better, imagine yourself in a snowbound cabin with the wind screaming outside, your children crying from hunger, and the body of your neighbor lying cold beside you. What choice would you make? And if you found yourself disturbed but fascinated by this hidden side of history, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. There are countless more forgotten stories waiting to be uncovered, stories that will change the way you think about the past forever. The frontier was not only a land of farmers and wagon trains. By the mid-19th century, it had become a feverish landscape of miners, prospectors, and boomtown dreamers chasing gold and silver. Where there was hope of riches, men swarmed by the thousands. And yet, for every fortune pulled from the earth, there were countless tragedies buried in forgotten gulches and frozen mountain passes. Among them were tales that no one wanted to admit: prospectors who starved, miners who turned on one another, and camps where the only meat left was human. Mining culture in the frontier was uniquely dangerous. Unlike farming families who often traveled with wagons, miners frequently struck out with only a few companions, carrying little food, trusting they could hunt along the way. But the mountains of Colorado, Utah, and Montana were not forgiving. Early snows, empty hunting grounds, and isolation could turn a treasure hunting expedition into a death trap. One of the most notorious cases was that of Alfred Packer, sometimes grimly remembered as the Colorado Cannibal. In 1874, Packer and 5 companions set out into the San Juan Mountains, hoping to strike gold. The winter was brutal, the snow bottomless, and the men soon lost their way. Months later, Packer emerged from the wilderness alone, gaunt but alive. His story at first was simple. His companions had died of hunger or exposure, and he had eaten them only to survive. But when searchers later found the campsite, the evidence painted a darker picture. The bodies appeared to have been butchered with deliberate cuts. Bones were cracked open for marrow, and the distribution of wounds suggested murder, not scavenging. Packer was arrested, and his trial became a national sensation. The judge allegedly told him at sentencing, "You man-eating son of the bee, asterisk, 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 I sentence you to hang." Though the line may have been embellished by newspapers, the reaction it captured was real. Americans were both horrified and captivated by the idea of a man surviving through such means. Packer insisted he only ate the dead, but the debate over whether he murdered his companions lingers even today. His story, sensationalized in newspapers, was a reminder that cannibalism was not just a rumor of the distant past, it was happening in living memory. And Packer was not alone. The San Juan Mountains alone were littered with whispers of similar cases. Miners would vanish in the snow, and when survivors crawled back, skeletal and half-mad, people quietly wondered how they had endured. In some cases, bones gnawed clean were later discovered in abandoned camps. The mountains kept their secrets, but those who lived in mining towns knew better than to ask too many questions. The hunger of mining camps also exposed a larger truth. The frontier was not an equalizer. Hunger and desperation often magnified inequalities. The stronger preyed on the weaker, and the most vulnerable immigrants, the poor, the isolated, were the ones most often sacrificed when starvation struck. Accounts from frontier newspapers describe unnamed foreign miners disappearing in storms, only for their companions to return alive with suspicious stories. Few pressed for details, because in a world where hunger ruled, morality was negotiable. But miners were not the only ones who faced such horrors. On the great trails west, the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, and lesser-known routes through the Rockies, wagon trains continued to risk catastrophe. Every year, dozens of families would set out too late in the season, only to be caught by early snowfalls. And every year, some of those families disappeared. Survivors who staggered into settlements often refused to speak of what had happened. Others told vague tales of struggles too grim to recount. The newspapers filled in the gaps with their own lurid speculation. A chilling example occurred in 1850, when a wagon train bound for California was trapped in the Sierra Nevada, the same mountains that had consumed the Donner Party just 4 years earlier. Reports claim that when rescuers reached the camp, they found bones stripped of flesh and evidence of cooking fires. Survivors admitted only reluctantly to what had happened, and the story was soon overshadowed by the gold rush frenzy. But it showed that the Donner Party had not been an isolated freak event. The Sierra Nevada was a graveyard where hunger stalked every unlucky traveler. Even military expeditions were not immune. In 1849, during the height of Western expansion, a small detachment of soldiers attempted to cross the Utah desert. Supplies ran out faster than expected, and water was nearly impossible to find. When rescuers later found the survivors, rumors swirled that they had eaten to live. Official reports scrubbed the details, but soldiers who were present whispered about gnawed bones and desperate acts. The U.S. Army, eager to maintain its image of discipline and honor, buried the truth. But the silence itself speaks volumes. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of these frontier cannibalism stories is how they highlight the razor-thin line between order and chaos. In towns, under the watchful eye of neighbors, men and women abided by social norms. But strip away food, shelter, and hope, and those norms disintegrated with astonishing speed. Hunger made killers of some and scavengers of others. And when survivors returned, the communities around them faced an uneasy choice: shun them as monsters, or accept them as tragic victims of a merciless land. This is where the myths of the frontier clash with its reality. The mythology told Americans that the pioneers were heroes, taming the wilderness through sheer grit. The reality was that nature often tamed them, breaking them down until only instinct remained. Cannibalism was not the image America wanted to project. And so, in histories and textbooks, it was excised, left out, or turned into a sensational footnote. But the stories endured in whispers. Families carried the memory of ancestors who had done what they had to do. Old miners in saloons told tales of men they known who came back from the snow, but never the same. And native peoples, watching the settlers blunder into starvation again and again, often told their own version of the stories. That the newcomers did not respect the land, and so the land consumed them. There's another angle to this story that historians rarely confront directly. Cannibalism, in the frontier imagination, became a way to draw boundaries between civilized and uncivilized. Settlers frequently accused native peoples of the practice, often falsely, as a way of justifying violence against them. Yet in the cold light of historical evidence, it was often the settlers themselves who committed it. In the end, cannibalism on the frontier was not about savagery, it was about survival. And survival makes hypocrites of us all. By the late 1800s, the age of the wagon train had begun to fade, replaced by railroads and telegraphs. But even then, frontier cannibalism had not entirely disappeared. Prospectors still vanished in remote valleys. Small towns whispered of men who had gone mad in winter cabins. And newspapers occasionally resurrected the stories, printing sensational headlines about man-eaters in the Rockies. Each time, the public reacted with horror and fascination, eager to consume tales of those who had consumed others. What we're left with today is a patchwork of stories half-remembered, censored, or sensationalized. Some may be exaggerated, but the sheer number of accounts points to a grim truth. Cannibalism was not rare. It was a shadow woven into the fabric of frontier life. And so, the question returns: how would you have fared? Alone in the mountains, starving in a blizzard, with only the body of a fallen companion beside you, would you cling to morality and face death? Or would you cross the line, knowing you might be forever changed? The American frontier forced that question on more people than we care to remember. And while their stories are forgotten, the truth remains. The price of survival was sometimes too high for history to admit. If you're finding these forgotten truths as chilling as they are fascinating, stay with us, because in the next part, we'll explore how these stories were covered up, sensationalized, or twisted for politics and legend. And we'll see why the silence around frontier cannibalism says as much about America as the acts themselves. By the close of the 19th century, the American frontier was being transformed from a living reality into a national myth. Railroads tied the coasts together. Telegraph wires stitched towns into communication networks. Newspapers in the East no longer carried daily reports of wagon trains stranded in snowstorms or prospectors vanishing into the Rockies. The wilderness was receding, and with it, many of the darkest stories of survival began to be buried, not only by snow and time, but by deliberate acts of forgetting. Cannibalism on the frontier became a stain that America did not want to see. For a young nation striving to project strength, destiny, and moral superiority, the idea that its pioneers had sometimes survived by consuming the flesh of their companions was intolerable. So history was rewritten. In school books, the frontier became a place of heroic struggle and ultimate triumph, where hard work and family bonds carried settlers through adversity. The grotesque truths of starvation and cannibalism were reduced to whispers, jokes, or the occasional sensational headline. Yet those stories did not entirely disappear. They lived on in family lore, in the margins of old newspapers, and in the twisted humor of mining towns. Take Alfred Packer, the infamous Colorado cannibal. After serving time in prison, he became something of a morbid folk figure. College students at the University of Colorado still joke about the Alfred Packer Grill, a cafeteria named in his dubious honor. The fact that such a grim story could be turned into campus humor says something about how Americans process their darkest history, not by denying it outright, but by turning horror into folklore, into something safe to laugh at. But not all stories could be so easily laughed away. The Donner Party remained a cultural reference point for generations. Every retelling seemed to spark new debates. Had they truly eaten the dead? Had anyone murdered for meat? Was cannibalism a choice, or simply an inevitability when trapped in a mountain pass with no food? Even today, the name Donner evokes shivers, standing as shorthand for both tragedy and taboo. Beyond the headlines, though, there were countless smaller, quieter stories. Families that disappeared in the Sierra Nevada. Soldiers who never returned from the desert. Prospectors who stumbled out of the mountains alone, gaunt and haunted, never quite explaining how they had survived. These stories rarely made the history books, but they left traces in local lore, in bones found by hunters, in whispered warnings passed from one generation to the next. It's important to understand why these stories were pushed to the margins. Cannibalism was not merely shocking. It struck at the very heart of how Americans wanted to see themselves. The frontier was supposed to represent courage, piety, and endurance. The idea that settlers might have surrendered to desperation, tearing flesh from the dead, made them seem less like heroes and more like victims of a savage landscape. And in a society obsessed with dividing the civilized from the savage, such admissions threatened the very narrative of manifest destiny. This was especially evident in how cannibalism stories were used as weapons in cultural conflicts. Settlers frequently accused native peoples of cannibalism, often without evidence, as a way of portraying them as barbaric and justifying violence against them. Meanwhile, settlers who resorted to cannibalism often received a more sympathetic portrayal. They were described as tragic figures, forced by starvation into unthinkable acts. The double standard is clear. Cannibalism was horrifying, but when performed by settlers, it could be explained away as necessity. When attributed to native peoples, it was framed as proof of inherent savagery. This hypocrisy reveals as much about American society as the cannibalism itself. It shows how the frontier myth was carefully curated, how uncomfortable truths were buried, and how stories could be twisted to fit political purposes. The silence around cannibalism wasn't just about shame. It was about maintaining control over the narrative of what America was supposed to represent. But beneath the silence, there is something profoundly human about these stories. They remind us of the fragility of civilization. Strip away the comforts of food, shelter, and warmth, and we are not so different from those who lived 2 centuries ago. Hunger gnaws at the mind, erodes morality, and drives people to choices they once thought unimaginable. Cannibalism is not a frontier story alone. It is a human story, recurring across cultures and centuries whenever starvation takes hold. Think of the parallels. In the Andes in 1972, survivors of a plane crash were forced to consume the bodies of the dead. In wartime sieges throughout history, from Leningrad to ancient cities under blockade, cannibalism has appeared as the final, desperate resort. The frontier was not unique in this respect. What makes it striking is how determined Americans were to deny it, to pretend that their own ancestors had been immune to the desperate choices made by starving people everywhere. Yet perhaps that very denial is why the stories fascinate us so deeply today. We live in an age of abundance, where starvation is rare in most of America. The idea that our great-great-grandparents might have boiled bones for marrow or carved flesh from the dead seems inconceivable. But it happened. And when we confront that truth, we are forced to ask difficult questions about ourselves. How far would we go to survive? What does desperation do to the human soul? And once we've crossed that line, can we ever return? Some survivors of frontier cannibalism seem to recover, returning to normal life, marrying, raising families, leaving little hint of what they had endured. Others never escaped the shadow. Rescuers often describe them as haunted, their eyes hollow, their words hesitant. Communities sometimes treated them with a mixture of pity and suspicion, as though they had been marked by something unclean. Survivors themselves rarely spoke of it, except in brief, evasive remarks. Silence became their refuge. That silence is part of why these stories have been forgotten. They were not passed down in family tales with pride, like stories of homesteading or wagon trains. They were buried, locked away, because no one wanted to remember that their ancestors had faced such choices. And yet, history has a way of seeping back through the cracks. Old diaries are found in attics. Newspaper clippings resurface. Archaeologists stumble across bones with strange cut marks. And each time, we are reminded that the frontier was not only a land of courage and dreams, but of nightmares. The forgotten cannibalism stories of the American frontier are more than grotesque curiosities. They are reminders of what the frontier truly was, a place of hunger, struggle, and limits. A place where nature often triumphed over human will, and a place where survival sometimes came at a cost too terrible to speak aloud. As we close this story, imagine yourself in their place. The snow is falling outside a cabin in the Rockies. The food is gone. Days have passed without a single successful hunt. One by one, your companions weaken, collapse, and die. The fire burns low, and the wind howls through the cracks in the walls. In the corner lies a body, still and silent. Your stomach twists with pain. Your mind tells you that to eat is to become something monstrous. But your body whispers that to eat is to live. What would you do? That was the question faced by countless men and women on the frontier, though history rarely records their answers. Their choices, their silence, and their survival or their death are woven into the forgotten fabric of America's past. And though we may try to look away, these stories remain, waiting for us to confront them. The frontier was not only built on courage and ambition, it was also built on hunger, desperation, and secrets too terrible to admit. That is the unvarnished truth of the forgotten cannibalism stories of the American frontier.